Welcome to our webinar series on participation and representation in the digital age. My name is Jenny Oser, and I'm a professor of politics and government at Ben-Gurion University. I'm also the principal investigator of an ERC project on this topic, and I'm honored to introduce our speaker today, Professor Christopher Wlezien of the University of Texas at Austin. Chris is a leading scholar of public opinion and representation who has published influential research in all of the top journals and book presses in the field. He was also recently elected in 2024 as a member of the prestigious American Academy of Arts and Sciences, which recognizes excellence in leadership across all academic disciplines in the United States. Chris's talk today will focus on a working paper that he shared with us with the intriguing title, Democratic Policy Representation is Really Hard. To make the most of our time, here's how we'll run this webinar. First, Chris will speak for about a half hour. I'll give him a 2-minute warning before we get to the end. Second, I'll introduce our course panelists who prepared questions in advance. And third, we'll select questions that participants submit to us in the chat. So we welcome you to send that. We'll put the link in the chat as the talk starts. A final technical note I'll also drop in the chat. If you'd like to see a written transcript during the webinar, we've enabled this feature and you can activate it by clicking on your Zoom screen's bottom right option labeled More, and then click on Transcript. Thank you for joining us. And Chris, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jenny, very much for the inviting me and for that introduction. And let me just get this up. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about an essay I have been working on for a long time now, many years, and early versions of which I actually presented just down the road a piece. And Jenny was at both, so I'm sorry. One was at Lakeland University and one was at Tel Aviv, both in 2022, I think. And it was motivated by concerns about the substantive representation of public preferences, particularly in policy, right? So we're thinking of like decisions that government actors take and actual outputs, right? What actually ends up happening. And so the kinds of questions that I think we should be starting with is how much policy representation is there really? How much actual responsiveness to public preferences is there? Is there really too little, as a lot of research seems to either say or imply? Or is it about the right amount? I mean, in theory, it could be too much, right? And the idea here is that answers to these types of questions obviously depend on our expectations. And to frame answers, I consider the requirements for effective representation and responsiveness, and that's what I'll be talking about today. So let's get going with the basics. And pardon me, I just find it really, really useful just to lay out a foundation, and then we're going to move pretty quickly. There's a lot on the slides. I won't be reading them, but you're welcome to, and I think you'll have access to them later if you want. And if you want to follow up on anything, just let me know. But here we are: opinion and policy. Does public policy, underlined for a reason, reflect the wishes of the public? And what we're interested in here is does the public get what it wants, right, in actual decisions and government outputs? And it's useful for those of you who don't do a lot of policy stuff. Is I'll make a distinction between outputs and outcomes. And outcomes are things that actually are produced by government, and outputs, that's outputs. And outcomes are what sort of happens as a result of those outputs and other things that affect reality, right? So to be clear, when we're talking about what the public wants, it's about preferences. It's not about interests. And I'll get more into this, but it's just hard to do the latter. I mean, some of us try to do that stuff, but it's really, really hard. I don't know your interests. To what degree does the public get what it wants? Is it a large degree, a small degree? Under what conditions? And these are really, really important questions. And they're important even if you think that the public shouldn't have a lot of influence, right? Regardless of whether you think they should or should not impact policy, whether they do matters, right? And there's this obviously a massive amount of work in this area, and you probably are all very well aware of this. Most of it focuses on positions, right? And there's a lot of different ways of measuring positions, but I'm not going to get into all that. There's the classic, right, work on dyadic representation, matching up the positions or votes of of representatives and their districts. There's a lot of work of late, in particular, focusing on more collective representation, thinking of parties and publics. They could be partisans or more general publics, and governments and publics, like party system, more broadly. There's some fairly recent research by comparison with this other stuff focusing on actual priorities, and all this work shows a lot of positive associations, not always and not always to the same degree, but there's a lot of positive relationships between measures of the public and positions and those of political actors. Okay, so this is really, really important work. And so, but it's not, it's not the same thing as policy, right? So positions and priorities and policies are different things. And increasingly, I think, as you know, there's a good amount of work on policy. Almost all of this looks at correlations between opinion and policy. A small portion attempts to assess the actual match between the public's preferences and policy actions. I was tempted to put attempts in bold or italics or underline or something like that. And we'll get to that. So the question then becomes, what have we learned? Does the public really get what it wants? It's really hard to tell based on this work, I think, but the results we do have are mixed, and this has led, a good number of scholars to bemoan the lack of representation, and that's, that it's interesting, is you'll be remember being with Jane Mansbridge and tell me we're having this conversation, and Jane even asked me, said, "Do you think there should be a law?" And I said, well, it depends on what you mean. And it was really a great conversation. We continued it later. It was a great event. Mikal was a fantastic host. And anyway, it's mostly focused on decisions, this work, not actual policy outputs. And I just want to flag that for you. We'll revisit that later. Okay, so what I'm focusing on today are the conditions for effective representation. And what does that mean? And I want us to think about congruence, and that's really this actual match between, again, what the public wants and what the public gets, and then responsiveness, whether or not there's actual, let's say we find the match, is that a match the result of policymakers actually responding to us, or does it come about for other reasons? Okay, these, and particularly responsiveness, requires a lot of us, the represented, and them, right, the representatives. And you can think about them as being like input side, output side, demand side, supply side. And what we're going to see as we go through, I'll use those words fairly interchangeably. I tend to rely on input and output. Political scientist, right? The requirements are not easily met, and political institutions are further complicating of all this on both sides, actually. And I think in the end, this in bold is really probably the message, one of the takeaways, but there's more fine-grained message, I think, as we go through. But there's probably, I actually am surprised that we see as much congruence and responsiveness as we do. Be interested to see what you think. Okay, so formalizing, what exactly is policy representation? Ideally, we'd have measures of actual outputs. I've already flagged that we rarely do that. We usually focus on decisions. I think you probably know, and we'll talk about this a little bit, there's oftentimes a disjuncture between decisions and outputs, and sometimes it's really surprising, like even in spending, or like you think, okay, God, if they pass a bill and then something else, the match between that and what actually happens can be substantial. But there would be, so ideally we'd have these outputs, and that would be P, and that would be a positive function of P star, which is the public's preferred level of output, right, from government. And it's really important here to think about this preferred level of policy, and that's going to be a theme that I've focused on some in my previous work, that in case you've come across it, and I'll be really centering on it today, spending a little less time on it than I have in the past. Again, we're focusing on preferences, not interests. It's just really hard to do the latter. I'm just not comfortable doing it. Research in this space typically focuses on the median citizen. Doesn't have to, but that's that's just the way it is, and there's good reason for that, although other people consider inequality. I won't be spending a lot of time on the inequality stuff today in the body of the talk, but I have slides to talk about that if you want to get to that. Okay, congruence. So representation is just this positive function. Congruence is an actual match between these two things, right? P star and P. Golder and Stramsky refer to this kind of matching as absolute median citizen congruence. I really like that piece. I find it really useful to reference, and I think a lot of people are aware of it. So how can we formally depict a congruence? We take that very general sort of loose functional form that I showed you in equation 1, and we add some parameters, right? Following Aiken in 1978. And remember, these the units could be spatial, policy types, dynamic, there's all kinds of stuff going on here, right? And if there's congruence, that equation, the coefficient relating P star and P would be 1, and the intercept would be 0, right? And ideally, there'd be no error term, right? The error term would drop out. So there'd be an exact match. P would equal P star. Okay, so if B is greater than 0 and less than 1, there'd still be a correlation, right, between the two, but there would not be an actual match. Okay, so that's congruence. So how can we say get there and say that's going to be really important, that congruence is, because what we're talking about here, right, is a match between, just to go back real briefly, is a match between what we actually observe in policy outputs. Keeping in mind we have a hard time observing our policy outputs. We can oftentimes see policy decisions pretty directly. How about getting a P star, right? I mean, do we have really good measures of that, right? So just keep that in mind, and we'll be revisiting that in a little bit. But let's just say we had that. How could it come about? One way is indirect, right? Where, there is a result, say, of selection, where we pick people. Maybe they're a random sample of us. Maybe we pick people who reflect our views. That's kind of what some democratic theorizing would imply. Even if it doesn't necessarily manifest itself in practice as much as we would like. But that might not happen, right? So we might not get this indirect representation, and so there's a disjuncture, right? And so, what happens when there is a difference between what we want and what they want to do? Do they do what we want or what they want, or somebody else wants? And this is a more direct way towards representation, what some of us refer to as responsiveness, keeping in mind that a lot of people refer to responsiveness just as the correlation between government actions and preferences. Many of us, I think, really think of, maybe most of us think of responsiveness as actually, identifying, paying attention and following, right? The preferences of us or anybody else, depending on who they're responsive to. And so there's from the public point of view, there's a kind of opinion shock, and then the government responds accordingly. Question mark, right? So it's an empirical question. Okay. So this responsiveness is a dynamic phenomenon, and it involves policy adaptation, which is important as a marker. It's part of the justification, this kind of responsiveness for representative democracy. In practice, of course, even if we have really, really good measures of all this stuff, it's really hard to actually identify responsiveness. We could get at statistical responsiveness, but that could be deceiving. But we could still think about it, right? So it's hard to do experimentally, obviously. It does make important the kind of work that Butler and Nickerson did, which I think I'm happy to talk about more. It's a little bit different to the main theme of today. Okay, so we can, however, think about, okay, so what does actual responsiveness require, right? So like what's involved here? And that's what I'm going to be focusing on now. And it's going to be, there's a lot, we can go as deep as you want here, but this is a smart group. I know that. And I don't think I need to go super deep, but I'm happy to do whatever you want in Q&A and afterward as well. I'm pretty easy to find. Okay, so this input side, remember, and there's the output side, the sort of the demand side, supply side. And so what is the first thing we need to have is people actually have to have preferences for policy, right? And keep in mind, what we're talking about here is preferred levels of policy, right? Uh, and we can think about them as being either very, very direct or indirect. And there's some evidence, right? There's evidence that this is the case, right? And they aggregate up sensibly. But the extent to which this case is probably isolated, seemingly isolated. Sometimes preferences are pretty thin. Sometimes they're weakly held, right? But there's reason to think that there are preferences for policy. How specific are they? Um, can we actually get very comfortably at congruence, even where people do have specific preferred levels of policy? Can we easily elicit them? Okay, so but we need to have these preferences, and then we need to have the public need to have information about government policy and the promises, right, on offer. And there's evidence here. This is a lot of the work I've done, right? Thermostatic stuff that this is the case, even though it again is seemingly thin and sometimes fairly general. Sometimes we don't have very, very specific information. Even where we do have specific information, it looks to be pretty specific. It tends to be pretty general, right? Like about defense or welfare. There are instances where we have more specific information, but does not seem to be the case everywhere. But there's a bit of good news here, right? So we do have this, there is some evidence of public having preferences. There is some evidence of the public having some information. And this is important because these preference signals then convey information, right, to policymakers. So there is something to represent, but that doesn't mean they will get represented because we also need incentives. And for that, right, that information has to matter to us, and we tend to oftentimes think about this in terms of vote. Probably more sensible to think about it in terms of like candidates or parties, because a vote effect requires choice, right, among the candidates and parties on that particular policy, and that's not always on offer, right? So, I mean, if two parties are offering the same thing, it's hard for that to matter, except insofar as we misperceive those positions. Okay, so these are the basics, and we're going to return to this last bit in a bit. These are kind of necessary conditions, but they're not sufficient, and they are limiting, right? I mean, there's some good news here, right, in the previous research, but it's not great news. And is that a problem for the public? Or is it just reflective of what the public cares about and wants? And we could revisit that if you'd like in a little bit. And here we are, right? It's really hard, right, to get at this P star, right? Even where people seem to have preferences, it's really hard for us, just to remind you, to measure like exactly what they want. Even relative preferences, which is something I rely on a lot, and you could think of relative preferences more or less, right? Policy as being the difference between what people want, their P star, and what they get. So maybe we can get at it indirectly, but that's really, really a questionable thing for a whole variety of reasons. The question wording gives, if we ask about welfare or the poor, we get very different answers. Even if we, even given the answers to the welfare one or the poor one or defense or whatever, matching that up with policy, like what does the public actually have in mind when they're answering these questions, is hard to know. And also this inference that R is a meaningful quantity, right, here depends on thermostatic response, which is not always the case. Even putting all this aside, that these preferences, do you think we should do more or do less in an area, spend more, spend less, are unconstrained almost always, right? And so potentially very cheap. There's no price to be paid. Yeah, sure, more education. Yeah, welfare, health, defense. And then you're made to choose, and there's a constraint, and those preferences turn out very different. That's Mark Henson's classic work from almost 30 years ago now. Okay, so again, right, we have a lot of work on positions, some on priorities. It's not clear what all this tells us about policy. It's not even clear how to measure sort of the median preference, priority preference, this vector of priorities. It's not straightforward. People have tried to assess directional policy congruence, right? So the bottom line is it's really hard to, what do we know about policy congruence? There's work on consistency, which is one of the areas where people first use the word congruence. And this was about like, okay, people want change. Do they get change? So directional policy congruence. More recently, we see a lot of work on absolute majoritarian congruence. And this is a match between majority support for policy, specific policies, and actual policy decisions. Lax and Phillips have done really great work in this area. And here's just an example question. And what do they find? They find a whole bunch of, when they do this kind of work in the American states, that they find a whole bunch of correlational, they call responsiveness, less congruence. But it varies a lot by issue characteristics and also institutions. And this is really, really a good step forward, but still limited. And because the responses really don't capture what people want, right? I mean, do you want the minimum wage to be $10? Well, let's say I want it to be 12, and let's say it's currently 7. And that's kind of the case we had with Obamacare. I mean, a bunch of was majority opposed to Obamacare, but a chunk of that majority, a non-trivial chunk, actually favored something along the lines of national health care, nationalized health care. And so they opposed Obamacare because it wasn't that. And so, if you ask them, well, would you take Obamacare over what we currently have? The answer would have been yes. Responses do not capture preferred levels of policy, and this is even true where we have seemingly binary policy choices, gay marriage. I mean, we can think about it. Wars can be fought, to different degrees, right? One of the stories about the Vietnam War in the United States, right, for a lot of people is that we didn't really fully commit the way we have to other. I don't want to debate that kind of thing. I'm just saying it's not a 0 or a 1. And these are not just angels on pins, right? We're interested here in actually getting at what people want, right? And whether we could capture that. There's some recent work going. I've done some work with Anne-Christine Cohn with conjoint analyses. Other people have too. There's some really, really neat work. Anthony Fowler and some others are doing neat work, just trying to actually ask people, like, what do you think the minimum wage should be? Very early days here, but good steps in the right direction. Okay. Really keep in mind is to the extent we even have a sense for preferences, there is this work showing that thermostatic response, good news, but it's not perfect news, right? From the point of view, you don't expect everybody's not noticing everything everywhere to the same degree. And there's also some evidence that policy matters for voters, right? There's lots of research on issue type voting at the individual level, and there's proximity, directional. Lots of questions about causality in this work. More recent work looks at election outcomes, and this is some of my own work, including with Matt Grossman. There's a presidential piece and there's a congressional piece. And we're working now to try to do something more comparatively. And here, what do we find here? That as policy drifts off left or policy drifts off right, there tends to be punishment. And it's very referendum based. It's very general, liberal and conservative policies, but the causal basis seems to be reasonably strong, right? So that's a little bit of good news. The problem is this vote choice. As you all know, if we think about a vote choice equation, a function of policy and other things, that other stuff first off, as we're going to get to in a moment, there's a lot of different policies, but there's also a lot of other stuff, right? And the economy matters, outcomes matter, like things like the economy, immigration, crime, but not all outcomes, right? Shark attacks don't really influence U.S. presidential elections. Other things matter too. I think you all know this: group identification, affects, attitudes toward democracy, constituency service, a whole bunch of stuff. A lot of this correlates with policy, some doesn't, right? But all this, the more stuff you pack into that equation, right, the weight of policy on the vote diminishes, and also increases the demands on policymakers. So let's talk about them. Do they follow our lead? Well, one possibility is we said they're like us. Another possibility is they're not, right? And if they're not, we need them to notice us, in our opinion, right? Both our priorities and our preferences. They need to care, right, about representing us. And that's may be a result of the electoral incentives, right? But it might just be that's just the way they're wired. And they are able to represent, right? And what do we have? We have a good amount of growing amount of research in this area. Uh, and there's some evidence that they notice us and our what we want, but it's mixed, right? Uh, some evidence that they care, but again, mixed. And also, there's evidence of constraints, right? There's basic like budget type constraints, but there's also political ones too. And so this is, this is a space. This is a space that's really important, and I would be really, really keen to delve more into if you want. In Q&A, but it's a space that I think it oftentimes gets a lot less attention because of the importance of the demand side. It's sort of a precursor to anything. Nothing really can happen on the supply side without effective demand, right? And that depends on preferences and information and incentives, right? Via accountability judgments. And that's why that gets a lot of attention. Beyond the general model, and this is really just a reminder, there's a lot of issues. And so when we put policy in there, it's really like policy sub I, right? Or sub J or IJ even. And so there's a lot in that. There's a lot of different issues and they could matter. And they all have salience weights, priority weights, there's preferences. This complicates equations, right? It's hard to measure what the public actually wants in any of these particular areas, right? Issue ownership can be a complicating force. People can have more trust in one candidate or one party just merely based on perceptions of ownership, which will tend to, right, diminish responsiveness, economy judgments, voting on the basis of what people do. Attention may be an end unto itself. This candidate, this party's paying attention to something that we care about. And maybe even regardless of policy change. So there's a lot
About
going
2
on
more
there
minutes
potentially.
until Q&A.
I'm sorry?
About 2 more minutes until Q&A.
You got it. Institutions can matter, and they're complicating. Government institutions can complicate things. The media can complicate things. Um, for the input side, they can complicate things also for the output side. And we are still all talking up till this point about government decisions almost always. Even if we're not talking about it, we're almost always empirically assessing it, not actual policy outputs. We have learned a lot about the former, right? Less about the latter. And, it's not even clear how much guidance the public actually provides here, right? I mean, and that's like how specific are our preferences. And this is I think seemingly, I'm flagging it because I think it's a really important, if pretty difficult subject for future research. And also, given how difficult policy responsiveness actually is, um, there's other, are there other sort of policy related roles for people, policymakers to play? Listening, right? Communicating that they're listening to us, making clear why they're doing what they do, explaining, and the public may actually like this, right? They may demand this, even if it's not the same thing as getting what they want in policy. Okay. So some concluding thoughts. I think I have just less than a minute. I think as you probably might have known already, hopefully I've probed things a little bit more and clarified things a little bit more than you came in thinking. Effective policy representation demands a lot. Those conditions are not easily met. And given the requirements, maybe we should be surprised by what we observe. Actually putting a quantification on that, actually putting, a fine line on that is really, really hard. And this, as I think you already know, is even true for most of the most privileged members of society. We have a little bit limited understanding of the various parts here. And I think most fundamentally, not because the output side doesn't matter, the supply side doesn't matter, but because the demand side is so fundamental, that part, but there are others, right? Who gets represented, polarization, and then there are the consequences, right, of this representation for approval and election outcomes, which is really part of the model. But other stuff, right, is not like system support itself, even though that could enter in via a vote equation, right? And also policy preferences. There's a lot to do. Some's underway. The early returns are promising, and I look forward to seeing what you all are doing in this space. So please let me know in the meantime. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thanks, Chris. You know, when we read out the title of your talk in earlier talks in the series, Democratic Policy Representation is really hard. It made the other speakers chuckle in the middle. And I think it just kind of speaks to how real it is in your, to acknowledge how complicated it is. And your talk really brought that to life even more than the paper itself. We're now going to proceed to the first round of Q&A. I'll introduce our course panelists who we all read the paper carefully together, and they'll lead the Q&A with me. All are BA students at BGU in Politics and Government. And a reminder to participants, we have even today just a fabulous group of participants. I'll highlight we have leading scholars, including Luca Bernardi from the UK, Liran Harzgor from Haifa, who's also zooming in from Sheraton in the UK. And among others, students and faculty. So it's really great to have people join in. We look forward to a really lively discussion, even if you haven't read the paper. But we'll start with those who have. And on that note, the first question is from Ori Kozma, who also studies mathematics. Ori.
Yes, first of all, thank you very much for your talk. It was really interesting. A question that I had was that from your research, I was really surprised to learn that there is um, that policy preferences can be fairly similar across income groups. This is something that you mentioned in the article. Why do you think that is? And do you think it would be different in a country where class politics plays a bigger role than in the US, for example, in Britain or maybe even in Israel?
That's a really good question.
Chris,
do we take
we'll
them?
take all of these questions
Oh, yeah.
one by one. No, we'll take all of these questions one by one. So you're welcome to take the time to go ahead and answer. Go for it.
Thanks. Sorry.
Yeah.
I feel like a thoroughbred horse racer wanting to run down the track. Okay, thank you for the question. I think I'm really glad you focus on that. I think that doesn't get enough attention. I think that's, and I will say this, it's strikingly true, seemingly everywhere. Not to the same degree everywhere, not to the same on the same issues, but it's particularly the case if you think about how big the differences could be. And we tend to like zoom in on differences, right? So, here, this group is 10% more supportive than that group, right? But if the range is like between, 0 and 100 or minus 100 and 100, right? 10 points, is really just from the get-go is not the very beginning. And we oftentimes, more often than not, don't find 10-point differences, right? We're finding much smaller differences. And, like in the inequality research on majoritarian support, that could be 0 to 100, right? And most of the time we're finding 52-48 or 76, 74, or something like that, where they're highly, highly correlated with each other. And so why is that the case? I'm a political scientist, and so I don't like to make things up. And so what I'll say is it's hard to give a direct answer, very, very specific, I think, answer that I'm really, really comfortable with. I do think that we do find differences in areas where, or along dimensions on which we could, different kinds of dimensions, which are not maybe correlated, say, with income. And the fact that we find them there makes me think that the income does not capture the main sort of divisions in society. That maybe they once did, or maybe didn't really to the same, to the degree we thought. To some extent because we didn't have the data. To some extent, maybe we just didn't look at it correctly. And my sense is that, the issue space has changed, and that may be part of the story, right? But even on issues that are really, really relevant to, income, right? Like taxation and welfare spending, you do find greater differences, but you don't find really, really vast differences. So why is that? Well, maybe we're not that self-interested. A lot of rich people are in favor of taxes and in favor of welfare. They're in favor of redistribution, right? And a bunch of poor people are opposed, right? So it seems like self-interest is really just not operating to the same degree that we might have expected. Is that a bad thing? Is that a good thing? I mean, would you like to be able to change that if you had a magic wand and could make people more self-interested? Does that help? It's Ori, yeah?
Yeah, thank you.
I can't see you. I'm sorry. Up here,
Oh,
it's you
do you see?
disappeared from my.
Okay, never mind.
Did you have a follow-up or no?
I asked also about what you check this all only in the US, or whether it's also true in other countries. Like I know for example that in the UK there is a bigger difference in specific, for example, in voting patterns, where poor people vote more for the Labour and rich people vote more for Conservative. So I was wondering, maybe there is more stark difference in preferences.
There's not much difference there either. And we have studied that. We have studied Canada as well. Other people have studied other countries and they find much the same. The transfer to vote is a little bit different, right? For vote, we need choice, right? So if the parties are offering choices on those issues and the voters really care about those choices and are deciding on those choices, then it will matter for vote, right? Even if their differences are not that big, right? You could have big differences and no vote effects. You could have small differences in vote effects, right? Or somewhere in between, depending on, right, the structure. Does that make?
Yeah, it's still surprising, but thank you.
Follow up separately if you like later on. Okay, thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Chris. Our next question is from Axel Cohen, who also studies psychology. Axel.
Hi, thank you.
Hi.
Wait. Okay, so even though the main conclusion of the paper you presented today is that governments are fairly responsive to public preferences, it seems much of the good data and research on this topic focuses on advanced democracies, like your prior research on the US, UK, and Canada. So I'm actually curious if you think there are ways that governments can and should try to improve responsiveness to public preferences, including in less developed democracies, like in Israel, for example.
Interesting. Do you consider Israel a less developed democracy?
I guess it's new.
Newer. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. I just didn't. I would be reluctant to make that statement. I just wanted to be clear where you are on that. So I think one of the things that's interesting about institutions matter, and I didn't spend a lot of time on that. And one of the things you have a system which is very different to the United States, right? And parliamentary systems, particularly proportional ones, tend to look very different to presidential ones where you have balance, right? But you don't. Balance is not hardwired, right? As we're seeing, right? We don't. We used to have a system that operated based on checks and balances, right, between the institutions, even when there were partisan agreement. We're seeing less of that today. So oftentimes when I'm talking about this now, I'll make reference to how what we have in the United States looks a lot like, or has moved in the direction of what a single party parliamentary system would look like, right? Where you get where they have a lot of control, right? A lot of discretion. And sure, there's the threat of the vote of no confidence, but that's a threat that oftentimes is used more by the government, right, than by the legislature itself. So in one sense, you have so the systems differ. You also you could say, well, we don't have a single party system, right? In Israel, we have a coalitional system, right? But much like in the United States, where you have the possibility of, I think, checks and balances, a coalition can be tighter, right, and less subject to breakdown, right, than others, right? And so, and one of the benefits to coalition usually is usually at least after elections, you have a sort of a position in government that's more like the average voter, right? And there's research backing this up pretty readily. Problem is when you go in between elections, when we're looking at, okay, say the public opinion changes, right? Do we expect that coalition to change in response to public opinion? It's going to be harder for a whole variety of reasons. And we could get into that if you want. So that's kind of what I would That's what I would say about Israel. And by comparison with the United States, and I mean, there are other presidential systems that look a lot more like the United States historically, right? There are other parliamentary systems that look like Israel, right? There are parliamentary systems that look different. So how do we, so what do we do to get governments to do things differently, like more to better reflect, well, that's really, I think that's really what I'm trying to get at today mostly, right? Which is that we have to have something for them to represent. We have to have the information, right, to use those preferences, right? And then we actually have to use those preferences, right? And then they have to actually notice, right, and care and be able to do it. And those are, to me, are the variables. I mean, the institutions, as I've discussed, can get in the way of that to some degree. They can complicate that kind of stuff, right? And we could change those institutions, but putting aside those institutions, about all we can change is what exactly I think, pointed to. And I don't think I'm really missing anything there. If I am, I'd love to hear from you. That's really the whole point of the piece, is to try to lay out the architecture of that. But I hope that was clear.
That's great. Go ahead, Excel.
Yeah,
You
excellent.
know, it's actually clear. I guess it's a whole different subject, the question, the differences between the systems and how it affects the representation.
And media figures in too, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
Thank you.
that's a whole other subject, right?
Yeah.
It gives us a lot to think about, especially these days.
Yeah.
Our next question here is from Devir Golan, who
Thank you.
also studies
Hello.
Jewish history. Devir, yeah.
Hi. There
Hey.
you are. Hi.
So my question is about that the paper focuses on the connection between citizens' public preferences and government responsiveness, but it doesn't describe how citizen preferences are communicated to political leaders beyond voting. So do you think that it matters whether citizens communicate their preferences in ways beyond voting, like protesting or social media?
Mhm. No, that's a great question. I like this. Yes, I didn't. That's sort of a sub mechanism, right? And that is important. No, very, very important. So the way I see it is these sort of you're talking about what I would describe as error correction. So if something's going wrong, right, in the system of stuff I've talked about, right? Like what, for instance, politicians, let's say politicians don't notice, right? Which I think is one of the reasons, right? Or don't care. One of the ways that protests can help correct, right, those, and readjust their views people can get them to readjust their views is to actually protest. So you can think about it as creating a very clear salience weight signal that we really care, and we're going to make you pay, right? If you don't do something that we want. Now, will that necessarily work? I don't know. I mean, do politicians tend to care about public opinion? Yeah. They tend to. Do they try to influence public opinion? Yeah. Do they recognize when the public is out of sync with them? Often, right? That explains a large part of the reason why they're able to stay in office as long as they are. Do they sometimes not do that? Yes. Can protests help solve that? Right. Yes. Are they perfect solutions? No. Are there any silver bullets here? I don't see that. But there's a role to play, right? There's a role for protests to play. And I really like the work that's occurred in this space in the last 10, 15 years. I know Luca Bernardi he was trained by some of the people who really pioneered a lot of that research. I know he's in the audience. I'm not trying to pinpoint him and get him to chime in, but he, I couldn't help but notice. Does that help, Devir? Or did you want me to go? Did I miss something?
No, it helps somewhat. Maybe I'll dive in more into Luca's work and your work.
And please follow up. I mean, any of you, whether you get a chance to ask a question or not, just please don't hesitate to follow up.
Excellent. And it's great, Chris, that you gave the shout out to Luca Bernardi. We're just now starting our second round of Q&A. where we have participants who already put questions into the chat. And it turns out the first one that came in was from Professor Luca Bernardi. So let's hear from him from the University of Liverpool.
Hi. Thank you, Jenny. And hi, Chris, again. It's nice to
Hey.
see you again. And
Well, hey, will I see you at EPOP?
probably you
Good,
will.
good.
I guess so, yeah. So I guess the first thing would be for me to tell you actually that the essay can be really useful for students in general. So I hope that you can publish this at some point soon, and we can share it with our students, because I think it explains in an easy way all the field pretty much in the opinion policy, or most of it, right? And so I think it would be really great for students to read this, undergraduate students especially. I wanted to ask you, so we were talking about protests before. Yeah, I mean, we did some research on attention and legislative attention to protest, and we didn't find much of an evidence that protest actually influences legislative attention. And there was a little bit of an amplification mechanism, so an interaction between public opinion preferences and protest, but only in some issues, like I think it was welfare. But then, as you were saying, Chris, there's all the other mechanism behind it. So when is it that we can find actually policy responsiveness to protest, which is a different issue? And again, it wasn't a direct thing. It was really a sort of a series of steps there. And I'm referring to the work that we've been doing with you probably were referring to Laura, my
Yeah,
thesis supervisor. Yeah. But my question was a different one, actually going back to the PhD. I think almost now 10 years ago. A question that's always been bothering me a lot. So when it comes to electoral incentives and responsiveness, right? Because there's all this competitive theory of democracy that he was telling us, right? That if politicians are afraid of losing the elections, and are they going to be more likely to respond, and so on. And I didn't find much of an evidence there during the PhD, at least not in more substantive policy venues. I wanted to know what you think about this, because when reading also the essay, you talked about institutions, for example, but I haven't found much on this other kind of a issue in the responsiveness literature. So I wanted to take the opportunity to ask you what you think about this. How do you see this as a sort of as a problem? Yeah.
Well, thanks. Yes. Yeah, the protest stuff, I think that's a hard space to work in, just to mention that. But well, first off, on publication, I hope this will see the light of day at some point. But as you know, that decision is not mine. So yeah, the protest is a hard space, I think, to work in here. But I would like to know, and I don't want to turn it back on you. I'll get to the electoral incentive stuff in a bit, but I would like to know what you and Devere think, and Jenny and others think about whether or not I should bring this in, at least, explicitly into the essay. Not maybe in a deep dive, but in some way, because I don't think I do at present. Okay, so let me know if you can. On electoral incentives, yeah, I know. I mean, I think the way I look at it is there's some evidence of people responding to incentives, but it's imperfect. I mean, it's to me, it's like a lot of this, do people have preferences? Yeah, to some degree. How specific are they? Well, in some areas they're okay, in other areas not so specific. Do they have information? Yeah, they have some. Is there, do they use it? Yeah, some. Do politicians notice? Yeah, some, right? Do they care? Yeah, some, I think. And can they respond necessarily? Yeah, sometimes, but not fully. And so that's kind of where I think that's, and maybe I don't make that clear enough, but that's kind of how I see the literature, and the way I often teach this stuff is, you could think of, like, let's say you have, like, your expectation between 0 and 1, right? Is like 0 is where you don't have anything, right, that you need to have effective responsiveness, and 1 is where you have everything you would like, sort of perfect responsiveness, right? Like the perfectly informed public, the perfectly monitoring public, the perfectly policy focused public, and so on, right? Are we closer to 0 or 1? I think we're closer to 0, but we're not at 0, right? How close are we? I don't know, right? It's very hard for me to say exactly. But, it's definitely not one, but I think it's definitely also not zero. And so that's, and I think the electoral incentive piece of the story is part of that, right? Politicians don't only go into office to win elections, right? And they don't have as much discretion there as they might like. Does that do it for you, Luca, at least to some degree, or do we need to keep going?
No. I think you're referring maybe also to issue ownership in a way, right? That obviously, if it's not their own issue, I mean, they may not be easily drive away from their own issues, right? To see it in sort of to see the problem from another perspective, right? Yeah.
Have you thought, I'm sure you've thought, you're such a smart guy, thought about like the functional form also relating preferences, and like one of the things I think about with respect to, say, Trump and Harris in the last election, and what, like right now we're seeing, for instance, a lot of thermostatic response to Trump's immigration stuff, right, and other policy areas, right? But one possibility is for people that they'll tolerate too much on immigration more than they'll tolerate too little, right? Too much policy, right? So is he overdoing it on immigration? Yeah. Are you okay with that? Well, it's not ideal, but you know what? It's a lot better than doing too little, right? And so these kinds of there's a lot, this translation of preferences and policy and information and given choice into actual vote, and is a complicated is pretty complex, right? And Trump, I think, gets that. I mean, Trump is like, yeah, the polls are showing me people don't like my policy on this, but they're not going to vote me out. I mean, what I care about is on that. I care about what election results show, and that's why a lot of the people who I think are, we're really paying attention to special elections here. I don't know how much you guys all notice this stuff, but I know it gets a good amount of coverage, but you have a lot of other stuff going on there. But we have reason to think that people pay special attention to what happens with votes, and that's what ultimately matters, right? To these politicians. And issue ownership is complicating that, right? Isn't that? I mean, doesn't he? Can a Democrat come along and do as well on that issue as Trump has?
Luca,
Should they even try?
If you have an answer to chime in there, we want to hear it. And I'll also note we received a question in from Dr. Leon from Haifa University that I think relates to this discussion, or let's see how her question has evolved as we've continued. Liran.
Yes, thanks.
Yeah.
Hi, Liran.
Hi, Chris. How are you?
It's great to see you. Thanks for coming. I hope you're okay.
Yes, I'm okay. I'm in the UK now. So,
well, I see you at EPOP.
No, I'm supposed to be in Israel before that.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Yeah, so thanks. I heard your talk in Israel, and
yes.
every time that I hear it, it gets me thinking about new issues about representation. So now I'm curious about this you distinguishing between outcomes and outputs, because I think a lot lately about the public opinion surveys and the measures that we use to study policy preferences. What do they capture, and why aren't they working so well? And if we relate it to, the crisis of representative democracy and what citizens don't get from their representatives, I sometimes think that citizens think in terms of more vague or general concepts. So, for example, in Israel, I want security. Will attacking Iran get that security for me? I don't know. I might have an opinion on that, but we monitor this question of should Israel attack Iran since 2013, and I'm not sure that if the government does it or not, does it really? I mean, you can talk about the congruence with public opinion, but would citizens be satisfied after that because they got what they wanted in the public opinion, right? The majority got what they wanted, or is it more of the outcomes, as you say, or right? And you can think about it if you think about the UK, so I want a good health system. I want short lines in the NHS. Will lowering the immigration rate help me? Maybe, but that's what I want. I mean, this is the outcome that I want. So we really put lots of I don't know, emphasis on the preferences, which is, of course, if we assume that voters are rational and they know what they want. But I wonder if the unrest in representative democracies today is because they don't get the outcomes that they want, and we still put our focus on the policy preferences, which does not lead us as political scientists to measure the right thing. Yeah,
I'd like to add in
thoughts.
Yeah, I'd like to add into that question. We have a final question from a student that I think relates to it and might help kind of wrap us up. I think this will be our last answer that we'll have time for. So Rod Rifle, if you'd unmute yourself and ask your question about future change, that'd be great. Go for it.
Hi, Chris. Thank you very much for your talk, first off, and for your time here. So my question pertains to the future, as Jenny stated. Do you think that these understandings uncovered by your work could be applied as a basis for future changes? Furthermore, do you think there could be correlation between policy making in high-level political systems such as governments and low-level political systems such as unions, communities, etc.?
Excellent, thanks. Chris, we want to hear.
There's a lot. There's a lot there, Rod. So I'm probably going to circle back and ask you to give me a little bit more because I'm being a little thick. Really quick on Liran, I could not agree more. You probably know that. I mean, after seeing the talk, I did not want to emphasize it too much, but I mean, the weight on, if we just put weight on policy and put weight on other stuff, what kind of, let's say it has to add up to 100, right? In our candidate evaluations and our votes. That policy stuff, I think, is probably less than, the smaller of the two, right? So, and but sometimes outcomes are closely connected to policy outputs, right? And there's always a relationship between the two, but sometimes they're much more closely related. Immigration is, I think, one that's very close connection between the two. And when you're talking about the UK and we're saying do more on the healthcare system, I mean, they want more healthcare. That's really the government doing more, right? So the government is really spending more, maybe doing things differently in a way that does a better job producing quality healthcare. But there's a pretty close connection there by comparison with some other areas where it's harder, right? We want a good economy. Okay. Do you care how we get there? Well, maybe, but maybe not, right? Prices are too high. I hope that helps a little bit on Rhodes' question about changes and I mean, what I see you saying is the complexity of the system. I think there's a lot of stuff up and down going on, and I think what you're describing is, again, it's a little like the other questions on like a sub mechanism. There's a lot going on there that we can delve into. That protest, for instance, it was, I think, where I responded there directly on that. In terms of changes, yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I think is really more important. I mean, in order to fix a car, you need to know how a car works. And I think that one of the things here is that, okay, so what's working? What does this car look like? What makes this car drive? What's working well? What's not working well? What can we fix? What can we not fix? What are we kind of stuck with? And I think I hope the piece helps provide that kind of architecture that would allow you to provide the answer, even if it doesn't directly provide the answers. Does that help?
Yeah, it does.
Go ahead.
It does. Well, please follow up, Rod, okay? I know we're running out of time, and I probably talked too long there, so.
No, it was great. I'll add in, it definitely helps, and I join into Luca's comment that the paper is already on the website, so people can already be learning from it, and we're looking forward to seeing it in print as well. So thanks to Chris and to the course panelists, to all our participants who joined us, an amazing way to wrap up a challenging year of lots of ups and downs, to end on this kind of an up. We're pleased to announce we already have an excellent lineup of speakers for the fall semester. So stay tuned for a formal announcement when we finalize dates and topics. And we look forward to having you join the webinar series again next year. Thanks, everyone.